of an update on that bananas story that we had to unexpectedly shift gears to cover at this time in the show last night, when the New York Times published late-breaking news about the Republican congressman who is probably the most high-profile, fanatical Trump supporter in Congress, Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz. The Times last night published the news that Congressman Gaetz is under criminal investigation by the U.S. Justice Department for sex trafficking. Now, I swear I'm not going to spend more of my life than I need to following every twist and turn in this somewhat nauseating story. But because we gave you the sort of backstory and context on this last night, I feel the need to update you tonight, because the sheer bizarreness of this story continued to advance across the course of today and tonight at what appears to be an accelerating pace. This started off weird. It's getting deep space weird. All right. First of all, there's this guy, a local Republican elected official in Seminole County, Florida. His name is Joel Greenberg. He's relevant to the story because his own considerable criminal troubles appear to have at least dovetailed with this newly reported criminal investigation into Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz. Joel Greenberg was elected tax collector in Seminole County, Florida in November 2016. As we discussed last night, Mr. Greenberg basically then immediately set out upon a course of behavior that started off like a fire hose of scandal and ended up like a tsunami of scandal. I mean, I can't even cram all of it into another lengthy news segment here, but just in rough chronological order, just looking at the high points, local investigations and audits found that starting basically as soon as he took office, he spent millions of taxpayer dollars on contracts and payments to his personal friends and some business partners, including 6 different people who had all been in his wedding several months before he got elected. 6 members of his wedding party just happened to get hundreds of thousands of dollars in contracts and deals from the local tax collector's office right after their buddy Joel, the groom from that wedding they were in, took over that office. What a coincidence. 6 people from the same wedding, huh? A county audit found that Mr. Greenberg then spent tons of taxpayer money from the office's budget, like over $1 million, on guns and ammunition and body armor and drones. Drones? It's like a little tax collector army or something. He and all the people who worked in his office under his leadership all started wearing guns at work. Again, this is not like a department of the police. It's not even like an office that goes after poachers, people who keep too many fish or something. These are literally the people to whom you pay your license fees. But they all started strapping guns on their hips at work and also wearing badges that, if you squinted, looked a little bit like sheriff's badges. They weren't. They were tax collector badges, but still. Mr. Greenberg himself was soon thereafter investigated for impersonating a police officer when he used his tax collector's gun and badge to pull over a woman he accused of speeding. He put on flashing lights in his tax collector car and pulled her over because he thought she was going too fast. He is the tax collector. And there's a lot more. It does go on and on and on and on. I mentioned last night the allegation that brought federal authorities to Mr. Greenberg's door and initially got him arrested and charged with multiple federal felonies, which ultimately led, we think, to the involvement of Congressman Gaetz. The initial federal allegations, which became the initial federal charges against Mr. Greenberg, came after somebody in Seminole County had the nerve to run against him for tax collector in Seminole County. Mr. Greenberg, according to prosecutors, then sent 9 letters to the school where this guy worked, the guy who was going to run against him for tax collector. Greenberg spent 9 letters purporting to be from students, accusing the guy who was going to run against him of inappropriate sexual activity with students at the school where he worked. Now, the allegations were completely made up. But it ended up being not a problem for his opponent. it ended up being a problem for Mr. Greenberg, because what happened was federal authorities ended up getting brought in to investigate this. Here's how the Orlando Sentinel wrote it up at the time. Quote, between October 10th and November 15th, according to the indictment, Greenberg mailed the letters to Trinity Prep that claimed to be written by students. School officials first turned the letters over to the Seminole County Sheriff's Office, but investigators determined that the letters weren't actually written by students, they were written by an adult. Because the letters were delivered through U.S. mail, the case was then turned over to federal investigators with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Assistant U.S. Attorney Roger Handberg said in court this week that Joel Greenberg's DNA and fingerprints were ultimately found on the 9 letters sent to the school where his opponent works. So 9 different letters, all purporting to be from students, all purporting to document terrible, terrible sexual misbehavior by this guy who was going to run against Joel Greenberg. Joel Greenberg leaves his DNA and fingerprints all over those letters, according to prosecutors. A criminal genius at work here, obviously, if what prosecutors say bears out. He also, according to prosecutors, set up fake Twitter and Facebook accounts in the name of the same guy running against him and in the name of other people who worked at that same school. Those fake accounts had their own fingerprints on them. They were ultimately traced back to an IP address on a computer at Joel Greenberg's house. He used his own computer to set up the fake accounts in the name of his opponent, in which he said that his opponent was like a segregationist and a white supremacist and a terrible person. Yeah, genius at work. Not difficult to trace those back to Joel Greenberg's house, according to prosecutors. But the problem with this criminal genius at work in these alleged crimes is that because of the way these things were done, federal law enforcement was brought to bear here. This ended up not being a local issue. This is not handled by the local sheriff's office. This is handled by the U.S. Attorney's Office. These are now federal charges. There's federal investigators involved. That all leads to his first indictment. But then it gets way worse from there. They turn up to arrest him on the first indictment. When they turn up to arrest him, it turns out that he has a whole ton of fake IDs in his backpack, in his car, in his wallet. That's going to be more federal charges. They ultimately charge him for stealing people's identities by stealing driver's licenses turned into the tax collector's office and then using them to make multiple fake IDs. What does he want to use the fake IDs for? Well, that is contained in the description of the next set of charges that he faces. After they do a search of his electronic devices, they decide that what he is using the fake IDs for is sex trafficking of at least one minor and other sex-related crimes. And so he faces multiple succeeding federal indictments, superseding federal indictments, as these charges continue to mushroom in Florida, in Seminole County. NBC News reported today that that latter part of the tax collector guy investigation, the part where they looked at his electronic devices and decided that what was going on with all of these fake IDs and this identity theft that he was doing through his office was that he was using those fake IDs to facilitate criminal sexual acts, including sex trafficking of underage persons. That part of the investigation into the tax collector guy ultimately led to what are now the newly reported details of this federal criminal investigation into Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz, who is also accused of sex trafficking of a minor. Now, Mr. Greenberg, the Seminole County tax collector guy, and Congressman Gaetz are reportedly close. There are multiple social media photos of them together. And now federal investigators are reportedly looking at whether Congressman Gaetz may also end up charged with sex trafficking of an underage girl. But while we were absorbing that detail of the story here, right, not just that these two guys are, one of them facing charges, one of them facing similar allegations that have led to a federal criminal investigation, but the connection of the sex trafficking charges against the tax collector guy to the sex trafficking investigation of the congressman, while that was sinking in today, that the investigation of Gaetz may have come out of what they discovered at this tax collector guy, while that was sinking in today, big surprise in this story. Maybe it shouldn't have been this much of a surprise, but it shocked me. Today, the tax collector, Joel Greenberg, was hit with yet another federal indictment. What timing? Since he was initially arrested and charged last summer Again, it all started with the stalking and identity theft stuff around the guy who was running against him for